Today, we're looking at the Arrow by Yawman. Inside the box, you'll find a number of items that come with the controller, like an end-user license agreement, manual QR code and welcome message, a P65 chemical warning card, a Yawman logo sticker, a USB-C to USB-A cable, and of course, the Arrow itself. The Arrow has only a few similarities with a standard Xbox controller, so let's see if we can try to make some comparisons. It has a 6-pack of buttons that can be compared to the ABXY, start and select buttons, a 5-direction D-pad, an analog thumbstick with a custom-made thumbstick cover and cap. However, the trim hat is not a second analog thumbstick. It also has pretty mushy shoulder buttons and mechanically linked triggers, and that just about does it for any sort of comparisons I can make. So let's move on to the extras that make the Yawman Arrow unique. And to kick things off, and probably the most obvious, are these 2 thumb sliders, which can be used to bind to 2 different throttle axes. There's also 2 push-pull sliders that resemble the throttle and mixture controls of a Cessna. There's also a rotary encoder which functions much like a mouse wheel, where scrolling up is one button press and scrolling down is another button press. Additionally, the D-pad is not just a 5-direction D-pad, but instead 5 individual buttons that can be pressed simultaneously, much like the 6-pack of buttons found here. Also, there's mechanically linked triggers that are meant to resemble a rudder pedal, but because of this, you cannot pull both triggers at the same time without risking breaking the system. On the backside, there is nothing but the Yawman logo with Made in the USA printed, as well as a USB-C port located at the top, which must be used with a USB cable to connect the Arrow to your PC. Wireless is not an option. There is also a 4-direction POV hat, which also has a center push, which is very useful for things like trim control or view control. And with that, we wrap up the quick overview. So now let's get into what I like and don't like about the Yawman Arrow. Oh boy, so let's start with the elephant in the room. This controller costs $250 US. I know, I was just as surprised as you are, especially considering the wording on Yawman's website. It reads, "The ultra-versatile Arrow is also ideal for the simmer who wants to fly without requiring major hardware investment." Okay, so maybe our frame of reference needs an adjustment, because my first instinct is to compare this $250 ultra-versatile Arrow to a $55 standard Xbox Series controller. I mean, after all, these are both very similar in footprint. I mean, they're both portable. They have buttons, they have triggers, they have at least 1 thumbstick, and more on that later. But maybe this right here just isn't a fair comparison. So while Yawman's website says the Arrow is ultra versatile, I want to provide my own take on that. In my opinion, I would say the Arrow has less in common with something like an Xbox controller, and more in common with something like this. An arcade fight stick. Now, hear me out. An arcade fight stick is a controller, except that it was made for one purpose, and that is to give a fighting game player the feeling that they're using an arcade cabinet. It is a purpose-built controller. And being a purpose-built controller, it is inherently not versatile. And much like this fight stick, the Yawman Arrow is also purpose-built. It is a controller made for flight sims and nothing else, which means it is not versatile. It is instead purpose-built. Now, I hear you saying, but Tuvas, you basically just described a HOTAS, because a HOTAS, or hands-on throttle and stick, is also purpose-built to bring the flying experience home to the flight simmer. So why should I pay $250 for the Yawman Arrow when I can get a T16000M HOTAS from Thrustmaster for $80 less? Simple. Portability. You're on the road, catching a flight, or at a coffee shop, or wherever you may be, and all you really have room for is your gaming laptop. Well, it's much easier to find space for something like the Arrow compared to a full-on stick and throttle, and much less a yoke and throttle quadrant. That is where the Yawman Arrow really shines. Now, that said, I am very tired from all that stretching I just did, so let's get back to business and break the Yawman Arrow down into things that I like and don't like about it. First up, and something I really like about this controller, the slider axes. This is something that a standard console controller will never, ever be able to do. And that is provide an axis that not only can be moved, but it can even hold the last position it was left in. And we get 4 of these. We have these 2 thumb sliders here on the right, but we also have these 2 push and pull sliders here at the very bottom. This is fantastic. I really wish we could have got axis controls like this in a gamepad format much sooner, because at least when it comes to flight sims, this is invaluable kinds of controls to have. You can assign things like throttle control to this axis. You can assign a secondary throttle control so you can have differential thrust, but not only can you assign throttle control, you can do other kinds of axis controls like zoom and wheel brake. Those are just some of the many different ways we can utilize these sorts of slider axes. Now that said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, because the inclusion of these 4 axes came at a cost. We do not have a right analog thumbstick. This is a massive loss in my opinion because we lost a huge asset. The right thumbstick is typically used for camera control, but now the Arrow lost that ability entirely in exchange for not an 8-way POV hat, but a 4-way POV hat. This means not only do we have to settle for on-off style camera control, but we also cannot go in diagonal directions. This makes for a terrible camera control experience. And when I say camera control, I don't mean just the pilot's perspective, but also other things like targeting pods that you would use in a game like DCS World. The right thumbstick is a huge loss, and what we got in exchange is simply subpar. Now that I've completely bashed on this whole right thumbstick situation, I really do wish I could have said that the left thumbstick was just 100% perfect, and unfortunately it isn't. But to Yawman's credit, they did provide a solution to my left thumbstick problem, but my left thumbstick has an issue. If I push it all the way to the left, it reaches the left side of the thumbstick well. When I say thumbstick well, it's this circular piece here that's on the shell of the controller. So the thumbstick stick reaches that side of the well, which is what we want. However, if I push it to the right, it's a little hard to tell, but it doesn't quite reach that right side of the thumbstick well. So what it's hitting right now isn't the plastic piece here, it is the actual very end of the module inside the controller, which means it's possible that you could cause breakage to the module because it's not being braced by this plastic piece here. Now the solution from Yawman themselves is simply push harder. When you push harder, what it's actually doing is pulling up on the thumbstick so that it can actually reach the thumbstick well all around. So what I recommend is don't push it harder, simply pull up on the thumbstick cap, and if you notice it's completely rubbing against the well in this current position because it's holding its position like that, so to avoid that, simply push down on it a little bit, and now you have a perfectly functioning left thumbstick. Now that's not to say that this problem with the left thumbstick is actually causing any functionality problems. Like, you could still pitch forward and back, you could still roll left and right. Still kind of upset that a $250 controller has this sort of problem, but it is what it is. And on the topic of build quality, this shell, this controller, this thing is not bending, it is not flexing, there is no creaking happening. This thing is solid. Now that being said, while the shell itself is solid, there's still a little bit of rattling that's happening with these 6-pack buttons here. I don't know if you guys can hear this, but let's see if you can. So I'm just shaking the controller in front of the microphone while I talk so it can actually pick it up. That is the sound of the controller's buttons rattling around in the slots that they sit in. It doesn't bother me that much, but I know there's some people who are watching this that would be very bothered by that, so just keep that in mind when you decide to purchase this. Now that being said, the face buttons here are actually very satisfying to use in my opinion because they are very clicky. I know that's not for everyone, but they are satisfying for me. However, there's a bit of inconsistency because the shoulder buttons are pretty mushy, and the 4 directions of the POV hat are just as mushy. However, the center click of the POV hat is just as clicky, if not more clicky, than these very same face buttons. So it's kind of weird that there's this kind of inconsistency between all the different buttons that can be pressed. And one more thing I really want to mention that I don't really care much about is this rotary encoder. So this is pretty clearly designed after a trim wheel that can be found, for example, in something like a Cessna 172. And this is not an axis. This is actually 2 buttons that can be infinitely pressed if you keep rolling in either direction. So one button is infinitely pressed as long as you keep rolling upward, and then another button is infinitely pressed as long as you keep on rolling downward, much like a mouse wheel. I mean, conceptually, this is a really neat idea, but in practice, not so much. For some reason, using the default rotary encoder settings, I'm finding that the inputs of this trim wheel are inconsistent. Sometimes I have to spin the wheel a bunch of times before any trim change is even felt, but other times, short and slow movements result in huge changes of trim. It's very weird. So if you run into this problem, check the manual for a button combination that you can use to change the trim wheel settings, and change it to something that'll work for you. And last but not least is going to be the triggers. So these triggers, I'm a little I don't know. I really like the idea that these are mechanically linked, because this will give you a proper kind of emulation of rudder pedals, because you can feel the response on one side when you do the other. So that's really cool. Also, I really like the spring tension that are in these rudder controls, because they are very strong recentering springs. I really like that. I just don't like that this even further solidifies the fact that this controller actually is not as versatile as the description would lead you to believe. Because let's say I wanted to play a first-person shooter, well, you can't do that, because in order to aim a gun you hold left trigger, and in order to fire it you pull right trigger, but you can't do that because these things are mechanically linked. Definitely a controller made for flight sims, definitely not a versatile controller, in my opinion. At least if you're comparing it to, say, an Xbox controller, which is actually incredibly versatile. So overall, what do I think? Well, if nothing else, the Yawman Arrow certainly does break the standard gamepad mold. It offers features that no other gamepad can, however, it does so at a very steep price. If it were up to me, I would embrace the standard gamepad design for non-flight sim use, while also including things like slider and rotary axes for flight sim use. But that's just me in my humble opinion, so let me know. Would you pick up the Yawman Arrow for 250 smackaroos? Let me know in the comments, and have a nice day.